My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way almost no one expected, and the most surprising part is not that your soulmate finally made a choice, it is the quiet way he made it when nobody was watching. For so long, people around him had grown comfortable believing he would remain exactly where he was, caught between what felt familiar and what his heart kept returning to. They thought hesitation had become his answer. They assumed that because he had not spoken clearly, he would never act clearly either. Even the third party began to believe there was nothing left to question. But yesterday, without a dramatic announcement, without asking anyone for permission, and without giving anyone time to influence him, he changed something that had been keeping him emotionally tied to a life that no longer felt true. And what makes this moment different is that the change was not made out of anger. It was not made to prove a point. It came from a realization he had been quietly resisting for much longer than anyone knew. Every time he imagined moving forward without you somewhere in his future, something inside him felt unfinished. That realization had visited him before, but yesterday he finally stopped pushing it away. Don't skip, because the choice itself is only the surface of what happened. The deeper story is hidden in what caused him to make it now, after so much hesitation. There was a moment yesterday when everything around him seemed completely ordinary. Nothing dramatic was happening. No one was demanding an answer. Yet something small brought you back into his thoughts with unusual clarity. Maybe it was a familiar phrase, a memory connected to a place, a song he had not expected to hear, or simply one of those quiet pauses when the mind suddenly becomes honest. Whatever triggered it, he could no longer look at his situation the way he had the day before. For the first time, he stopped asking himself what would keep everyone else comfortable and started asking a much harder question: what choice can I actually live with? And the answer did not arrive loudly. It came with a strange sense of calm. It pointed toward you. Here is what nobody around him understood. His hesitation was never proof that he felt nothing. In many ways, it existed because he felt too much and did not know what to do with it. Choosing the familiar path required less courage. Remaining uncertain allowed him to postpone difficult conversations. Staying where people expected him to stay meant he did not have to explain why one connection kept following him through every attempt to move on. But yesterday he saw the cost of that avoidance. He realized that delaying a truth does not make it disappear, sometimes it only makes the truth clearer. And suddenly, the situation he had been protecting began to feel heavier than the change he had been afraid to make. That is where everything started moving. He quietly changed something meaningful enough that the third party immediately sensed the difference, even before understanding exactly what had happened. Perhaps it was a plan he withdrew from, a future arrangement he no longer wanted to continue, a boundary he finally established, or a decision he had repeatedly postponed. Whatever form it took, the message beneath it was unmistakable: he was no longer willing to build tomorrow around a connection his heart had already begun leaving behind. And this is where the third party became deeply unsettled. Not because of one dramatic argument, but because the behavior they had relied upon suddenly disappeared. They were used to his hesitation. They knew how to respond when he doubted himself. They understood the version of him that stayed quiet to avoid uncomfortable conversations. But yesterday, something was different. His calmness could not be negotiated with in the same way. He was not trying to win an argument. He was not trying to hurt anyone. he simply sounded certain. Sometimes certainty is more powerful than conflict because there is nothing to fight against. Stay till the end, because there is one detail about what he said that changes the meaning of everything. The third party asked him a question they had probably asked before in different ways: why now? And for a moment, he did not answer. That silence mattered. He could have given an easy explanation. He could have blamed timing, circumstances, stress, confusion, or any number of things that would have softened the truth. But he seemed tired of explanations that protected everyone except himself. His answer, when it finally came, was surprisingly simple. He said he had spent too much time making decisions based on what he thought he was supposed to feel instead of admitting what he actually felt. Notice the difference. He did not suddenly discover something yesterday. Yesterday was the day he stopped denying something he already knew. And that realization reached much further back than anyone realized. There had been moments when your absence affected him more than he admitted. Times when good news felt strangely incomplete because you were not the person hearing it. Moments when he found himself wondering what you would say about something completely ordinary. Even during periods when he tried to convince himself that he had moved forward, his mind kept building invisible bridges back to you. He dismissed those moments as nostalgia. Then coincidence. Then habit. But eventually those explanations stopped working. Because nostalgia fades when something has truly ended inside you. His connection to you did not fade. It kept changing shape, becoming quieter perhaps, but also deeper and harder to ignore. There is another piece of this that deserves your attention. He did not arrive at yesterday's choice because he suddenly decided you were perfect. This is not about placing anyone on a pedestal. It is something much more grounded than that. He remembered how different he felt when he was emotionally honest with you. He remembered that around you, he did not have to perform certainty when he was confused or strength when he was tired. Something about your connection had made him feel seen without being controlled. And after living for so long inside expectations, that memory became impossible to dismiss. What if the thing he had been calling complicated was actually the thing that had always felt most natural? That question stayed with him. Quietly. Persistently. Until yesterday, when it finally became stronger than his fear of changing course. The third party noticed this transformation almost immediately. They could hear it in the way he answered. They could see it in the fact that he was no longer over-explaining. And perhaps most painfully for them, they realized they were not losing him because somebody had forced him away. He was walking toward a decision he had reached on his own. There is sadness in that realization, and it should not be celebrated cruelly. Every person involved has feelings. Every ending deserves some measure of compassion. But compassion does not require someone to remain in a place that has stopped being honest. And yesterday, your soulmate appeared to understand that distinction for the first time. Something important is waiting for you in what happened next, because after the conversation ended, he did something completely unexpected. He did not immediately reach for you. He did not rush to make a dramatic confession. Instead, he sat alone with the consequences of what he had just changed. That may seem like a small detail, but it reveals how serious this decision had become. In the past, emotion might have made him impulsive. Yesterday, emotion made him reflective. He wanted to know whether the choice still felt true when the room became quiet. And it did. Minutes passed. Then longer. The uncertainty he expected to feel never fully arrived. Instead, there was relief. Not excitement exactly. Not yet. Relief, the kind that comes when someone has finally stopped arguing with themselves. That relief frightened him a little because it confirmed something he could no longer pretend not to know. He had been staying loyal to a situation long after his heart had begun asking for something different. And when he allowed himself to imagine you again, he did not imagine some impossible fantasy. He imagined conversation. Honesty. A chance to tell you what had really been happening inside him. He imagined sitting across from you without excuses and admitting that the delay had never been because you were easy to forget. It was because choosing you would require him to become more honest than he had been ready to become. That realization changed the entire emotional meaning of yesterday. The choice was not simply between two people. It was between two versions of himself. One version continued doing what was expected because it felt safer. The other accepted that a meaningful life sometimes requires disappointing expectations in order to stop disappointing your own heart. Yesterday, the second version finally spoke louder. Yet there is still something you do not know. Something happened earlier that day, before the conversation, before the boundary, before the third party realized anything was changing. Your soulmate came across something connected to you that he had not looked at in a very long time. And when he saw it, one detail stopped him completely. It was not what he expected to feel. He thought enough time had passed that it would seem distant, almost like looking at someone else's story. Instead, the memory felt startlingly present. He remembered not only what happened between you, but who he had been when it happened. And for perhaps the first time, he recognized exactly where he had made the decision that eventually separated him from what he truly wanted. That is when yesterday stopped being an ordinary day. He began replaying choices he had once defended. He saw how often fear had disguised itself as practicality. He saw how many times he had said, "maybe later," when what he actually meant was, "I am scared of what happens if this becomes real." And then one question entered his mind that he could not dismiss: what if later had finally arrived? The thought stayed with him through everything that followed. Through the conversation. Through the silence afterward. Through the third party's disappointment. Through the moment he looked at his phone and almost reached out to you. Almost. Because his hand stopped. There was still one thing he believed he needed to do before coming toward you. One unfinished truth. One conversation he had avoided for far too long. And strangely, that conversation was not with the third party. It was with someone who had influenced his choices from the very beginning, someone who had always believed they knew what kind of future he should choose. Yesterday evening, your soulmate finally decided that before he could tell you what had changed, he needed to face the voice that had taught him to doubt his own heart. And when that person heard your name, their reaction was nothing like he expected. The room did not become louder when your name was spoken, it became still, and somehow that silence told your soulmate more than any immediate answer could have. He had expected resistance. He had prepared himself for another careful speech about timing, responsibility, appearances, and why certain choices were supposedly easier than others. Instead, the person sitting across from him looked away for a moment, almost as though your name had opened a door they had been hoping would remain closed. That reaction caught him completely off guard, because this was someone whose opinion had quietly shaped many of his decisions. Someone he had listened to when he was uncertain. Someone who had once encouraged him to choose what seemed stable rather than what felt emotionally true. Yet yesterday, when he finally said that he could no longer pretend you meant nothing to him, they did not immediately challenge him. They asked one unexpected question: have you felt this way the entire time? Your soulmate hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because saying it aloud would make everything real. Then he admitted something he had barely admitted to himself. Yes. Not every day in the same way. Not without confusion. Not without periods when he tried to move forward. But somewhere underneath all of that, the feeling had remained. That confession changed the atmosphere instantly. Don't skip, because what came next forced him to look at his own past from a completely different angle. The person who had once influenced him against following the connection with you leaned back and quietly admitted that they had noticed something long ago. They remembered how he used to mention you without realizing how often he was doing it. They remembered how his expression changed whenever somebody casually brought up your name. They had even noticed that whenever he tried hardest to convince everyone he had moved on, he somehow spoke about you more, not less. But they never told him. Instead, they assumed that time would eventually settle everything. They believed that if he committed himself strongly enough to another direction, those old feelings would simply become memories. Yesterday they finally acknowledged that perhaps they had misunderstood what they were watching. Your soulmate stared at them, because this was the last answer he expected. For years, he had carried the belief that choosing you would mean fighting against everyone who mattered to him. That belief had become part of the reason he hesitated. Yet now, one of the strongest voices from his past was sitting in front of him saying something completely different. Maybe we were asking you to make the choice that made sense to us, not the choice that made sense to you. There are sentences that sound simple until you realize how many years they reach backward and touch. That was one of them. Your soulmate became quiet again. Suddenly, he could see old moments differently. Conversations where he had been encouraged to be practical. Times when he had been told not to complicate his life. Moments when he had chosen silence with you because he believed that silence was somehow more responsible than honesty. He had blamed circumstances. He had blamed timing. Occasionally, he had even blamed the intensity of what he felt with you. But yesterday, he finally recognized another truth. Sometimes he had used other people's opinions as protection from making his own difficult decision. And now that protection was disappearing. There was nobody left to blame. Nobody left to wait for. The choice belonged completely to him. That frightened him for only a moment. Then something unexpected happened. It freed him. Stay till the end, because this was the point when yesterday stopped being merely about leaving something behind and became about what he was finally willing to move toward. The person across from him asked whether he intended to contact you. He looked down at his phone. Your name was closer than they knew. He had already opened your conversation earlier that evening. He had typed something, erased it, typed something else, then closed the screen. What could he possibly say after so much hesitation? I finally understand. Too easy. I made a mistake. Too incomplete. I never stopped caring. True, but somehow not enough. He knew that whatever came next could not be another emotional moment followed by uncertainty. If he entered your life again, even through a simple message, he wanted his actions to finally match his words. That was the part of him changing most deeply. In the past, he wanted certainty before taking action. Yesterday, he realized certainty sometimes appears because you finally take responsibility for an action. So he made another quiet decision. Before contacting you, he would finish untangling the things that had allowed confusion to continue. He would not arrive carrying unfinished promises, vague explanations, or emotional chaos and expect you to sort through it for him. He wanted to approach you with clarity. And strangely, that intention was what devastated the third party most. Not the possibility that he still cared about you. They had probably suspected that for some time. What affected them was recognizing that he was no longer treating those feelings like something temporary. Earlier, they had believed you were a memory he occasionally returned to when emotions became complicated. Yesterday, his actions suggested the opposite. He seemed to view the life he had been living as the temporary part, and his feelings for you as the question he had never truly answered. Still, there was no cruelty in how he handled the situation. He did not compare either of you. He did not turn one person into the villain and another into the hero. He simply acknowledged that continuing something without complete emotional honesty would be unfair to everyone involved. That realization hurt, but it was also the first truly respectful decision he had made in a long time. The third party asked him whether this meant you had already spoken. He said no. They asked whether you even knew what he was doing. Again, he said no. And that answer seemed to surprise them more than anything else. Because suddenly they understood that you had not been pulling him away. You had not been directing his decision. You might not even know that anything had changed. He was making these choices privately because something inside him had finally reached its own conclusion. Think about how different that is. It meant the shift could not be dismissed as temporary excitement caused by one conversation with you. There had been no secret persuasion. No dramatic reunion. This was happening because silence itself had finally told him what he needed to know. Your absence had not erased the connection. It had clarified it. And somewhere during yesterday evening, your soulmate realized something almost painfully simple. If he could still feel this strongly after all the distance, what exactly had he been waiting for? He remembered occasions when he nearly contacted you and stopped himself. Birthdays. Random evenings. Moments when something funny happened and you were the first person he instinctively wanted to tell. There were times he saw something you would have loved and found himself reaching for his phone before remembering the situation between you. Those moments had seemed insignificant separately. Together, yesterday, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. He had built an entire argument for why he should leave you in the past, while his everyday instincts kept placing you somewhere in his future. Something important is waiting for you, because late that evening, another detail surfaced, and this one was not emotional at first. It was practical. Your soulmate remembered a promise he had made months ago, something connected to a future plan he had agreed to while trying to convince himself that his current path was permanent. He had almost forgotten about it. But now that everything was changing, that promise suddenly mattered. Keeping it would quietly carry him deeper into a future he no longer wanted. Breaking it would reveal just how serious yesterday's decision had become. So he sat down and looked at the details carefully. He did not rush. He did not make a dramatic gesture. He simply asked himself whether completing that plan would be honest. The answer was no. And for the second time that day, he chose honesty over convenience. That was the secret change nobody had anticipated. He withdrew from something that had symbolized a shared future with the third party. Not to punish them. Not because you had demanded anything. But because he realized that continuing would create expectations he could no longer sincerely fulfill. When the third party discovered what he had changed, the reality of his decision finally settled in. Until then, perhaps they had believed this was another emotional phase, another difficult conversation that would soften overnight. But this was different. He had changed something concrete. He had accepted that his decision might create uncomfortable questions. And most importantly, he did it without knowing whether you would welcome him back. That detail is easy to overlook, yet it may be the most meaningful one. He was not choosing you because he had been guaranteed an outcome. He was choosing to stop living dishonestly whether or not you eventually chose him. That is growth. Real growth does not say, "I will change if I know I will be rewarded." It says, "I need to change because I finally know what is true for me." And yesterday, that was exactly where your soulmate seemed to arrive. Later, alone again, he returned to your conversation on his phone. This time he did not type immediately. He scrolled upward. Not endlessly, just far enough to find an exchange he remembered clearly. It was from a time when things between you were softer, before misunderstandings and hesitation created so much distance. There was one message from you that he had misunderstood at the time. Back then, he thought you were asking him for certainty he could not provide. Yesterday, reading it with different eyes, he realized you had actually been asking for honesty. You were not demanding that he know the entire future. You simply wanted him to tell the truth about where his heart was. And suddenly he understood why that moment had become such a turning point between you. You had asked for something simple. He had made it complicated because simplicity would have required vulnerability. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "I could have just told the truth." That sentence stayed with him. Perhaps you have had moments when you wondered whether he understood what his silence cost you. Whether he ever looked back and saw the confusion from your side. Yesterday, at least in this unfolding story, he finally did. He imagined what it must have felt like to receive mixed signals from someone who cared deeply but behaved cautiously. He realized that intention does not erase impact. He may not have meant to make you question your importance, but his inconsistency probably did exactly that. That recognition softened something in him. His desire to contact you changed. It was no longer only about telling you how much he cared. It became about taking responsibility for the ways he had failed to show it clearly. So he began typing again. This time the message was different. No dramatic declarations. No impossible promises. No expectation that you should immediately understand or forgive everything. He wrote that he had spent a long time avoiding a truth because he was afraid of what changing his life would require. He wrote that yesterday something finally became clear, and he did not want to hide behind confusion anymore. Then he stopped. There was one sentence he wanted to add, but he stared at it for several minutes because those words carried more weight than everything else he had written. His finger hovered above the screen. The message was almost ready. But before he could send it, his phone rang. He looked at the name on the screen and froze, not because it was you, and not because it was the third party. It was someone connected to you, someone who had never contacted him privately before. And the first thing they said was, "There's something about yesterday that you need to know." For one suspended second, your soulmate forgot about the unfinished message on his screen, because the voice on the other end of the call was carrying a detail he had never expected to hear. The person connected to you did not call to persuade him, accuse him, or tell him what decision he should make. They simply said that something had happened yesterday, something small enough that almost everyone else would have overlooked it, yet meaningful enough to change the way he understood your silence. He listened carefully as they explained that your name had come up earlier in the day, completely unexpectedly, and when someone casually asked how you were doing, you had not reacted with bitterness. You had not spoken badly about him. You had not tried to prove that you had moved on or turn the past into something ugly. Instead, you had paused and said something surprisingly gentle. You hoped he was finally making choices that brought him peace. That was all. A simple sentence. But it landed inside him with more force than any dramatic declaration could have. Don't skip, because he had spent so much time wondering whether you still cared that he had never considered another possibility. Maybe caring about someone did not always mean chasing them. Maybe sometimes it meant stepping back far enough to let them discover who they were without your influence. Hearing that you had wished him peace instead of demanding an outcome changed something inside him immediately. He looked again at the message he had been preparing to send and suddenly understood that approaching you could not be about relieving his own guilt or rushing toward a reunion because yesterday had been emotional. If he was going to reach toward you now, it had to be with the same maturity he had just heard in your words. The person on the phone continued, almost reluctantly, saying there was another reason they had called. They had noticed something about you recently. You seemed different, not colder, not closed, simply steadier. You had stopped explaining yourself to people who did not understand what the connection had meant to you. You were no longer trying to convince anyone that your feelings had been real. You were living forward. And somehow, hearing that unsettled your soulmate more deeply than hearing that you were still waiting ever could have. Because suddenly he realized the world had not paused while he was deciding what he wanted. You had been changing too. You had been learning how to protect your peace without hardening your heart. You had begun building a life that did not depend on whether he finally became brave enough to enter it. That realization brought him to an emotional crossroads. Part of him wanted to send the message immediately, afraid that another delay might become another lost opportunity. But another part of him understood something important: urgency and readiness are not the same thing. So instead of rushing, he asked the person on the phone a question he had never expected to ask anyone connected to you. Do you think I hurt them more than I realized? There was a pause. Not an accusing pause. An honest one. Then came an answer that stayed with him: I think the uncertainty hurt more than the truth would have. He closed his eyes. There it was again, the same realization appearing from another direction. It had never been necessary for him to have every answer. What you had needed was clarity. He had mistaken uncertainty about the future for permission to remain unclear in the present. And now, looking backward, he could finally see the difference. Stay till the end, because what happened after that call revealed exactly how much yesterday had changed him. When the conversation ended, he returned to the unfinished message, but instead of adding the emotional sentence he had been afraid to write, he deleted nearly half of what he had typed. Not because the words were false. Because they were too focused on him. Too much explanation. Too much justification. Too much about why he had been confused. He realized you did not need an essay defending the past. You needed something simple enough to trust. So he started again. He wrote that he had made some important changes in his life and that those changes were his responsibility, not yours. He wrote that he had finally understood how unfair his uncertainty may have felt from your side. He wrote that he did not expect anything from you, but if you were ever comfortable having an honest conversation, he would like the chance to give you the clarity he should have offered much sooner. Then he reached the final line. This time, he did not write, "I need you." He did not write, "Everything was always about you." He wrote something quieter, "Whatever happens next, I want to be honest with you." And perhaps that is where the deepest change happened. Because for so long, his feelings had been stronger than his courage. Yesterday, his courage finally began catching up. Yet even after writing those words, he did not immediately press send. Something else needed his attention first. Across town, the third party had learned more about the practical change he had made earlier, and the realization was becoming impossible to soften. What devastated them was not simply that one plan had changed. It was what that plan represented. For months, perhaps longer, they had interpreted his willingness to continue with certain future arrangements as evidence that he had chosen them fully. Yesterday revealed something more complicated. He had been moving forward physically while remaining emotionally undecided. And now, rather than allowing that contradiction to continue, he was finally ending it. The third party contacted him again. This time their voice was less frustrated and more vulnerable. They asked a question that made him stop completely. Was I ever really the person you wanted, or was I just the person you thought you were supposed to choose? He could have answered carelessly. He could have said something designed to make himself look better. Instead, he took responsibility. He said the connection had mattered, but he had entered parts of it while still carrying unresolved feelings he should have confronted first. He admitted that this had been unfair. There was no victory in that conversation. No one felt triumphant. There was simply truth arriving late. And sometimes late truth still matters, because even when it cannot erase confusion, it can prevent more of it from being created. The third party became quiet. They were devastated, yes, but something beneath the disappointment was also becoming clear to them. This had not happened because you suddenly appeared and took something away. It happened because your soulmate had finally stopped asking another person to hold together a future he himself no longer believed in. That distinction changed the entire conversation. They asked whether he was leaving because he knew you would take him back. He answered immediately, "I don't know what they'll choose." And those words surprised even him. Saying them aloud forced him to confront the full reality of his decision. You might say no. You might need distance. You might have questions he could not answer easily. You might simply be somewhere different emotionally now. And still, he knew the changes he had made yesterday were necessary. Something important is waiting for you, because this was the moment his choice finally became real. He was no longer rearranging his life to guarantee a particular ending with you. He was rearranging it because he could not keep building on emotional dishonesty. That meant whatever came next between you would begin on different ground. Not obligation. Not fantasy. Not pressure. Choice. Two people meeting again, if they chose to, with more truth than they had before. Later that night, after the third-party conversation ended, he stepped away from his phone and walked through his home in complete silence. Ordinary objects suddenly seemed connected to decisions he had postponed. A calendar. A photograph. A small item tied to a future plan that had once seemed settled. Nothing around him had physically transformed, yet the atmosphere felt completely different because his relationship to those things had changed. He realized something that surprised him: he was sad. Not regretful. Sad. Because choosing honestly did not mean the past had been meaningless. There were memories he respected, people he cared about, expectations he knew would have to be adjusted. Growth did not erase tenderness. It simply prevented tenderness from becoming an excuse to remain somewhere untrue. He sat near a window and allowed both feelings to exist at once: the sadness of ending one chapter and the quiet hope of no longer lying to himself about another. And then his mind returned to you. Not to some idealized version of you frozen in an old memory. To the person you might have become while he was absent. He wondered whether you still laughed at the same things. Whether your priorities had changed. Whether the experiences he had missed had made you softer in some ways and stronger in others. For the first time, he understood that if he came back, he could not expect to simply resume where everything stopped. He would have to meet you again. Learn you again. Earn trust through consistency rather than relying on history. That thought did not discourage him. It humbled him. And perhaps that humility was exactly what had been missing before. There was another realization unfolding quietly too. For years, your soulmate had imagined choosing you as one enormous decision, a dramatic leap requiring total certainty. Yesterday showed him that choosing someone is rarely one giant moment. It is a sequence of smaller choices. Choosing honesty when silence would be easier. Choosing clarity when ambiguity keeps everyone comfortable. Choosing responsibility instead of excuses. Choosing to listen when defensiveness wants to speak. Choosing not to promise more than you can actually give. And if the two of you ever rebuilt anything, those small choices would matter far more than one emotional confession. This was why the message remained unsent for a little longer. He was no longer afraid of sending it. He was considering whether there was one final loose end that could interfere with the honesty he wanted to bring you. There was. Earlier that year, he had allowed someone close to him to believe a version of your story that was incomplete. He had never directly spoken badly about you, but when they misunderstood why things ended between you, he had remained silent instead of correcting them. That silence had protected him from uncomfortable questions. Now it bothered him deeply. Because if he wanted to approach you with honesty, he could not continue benefiting from misunderstandings that made him look less responsible than he had been. So, close to midnight, he made one more call. The person who answered sounded surprised to hear from him. He did not waste time. He said there was something about you he needed to correct. He explained that the distance between you had not happened because you had asked for too much. It had not happened because you were impossible to understand. He admitted that he had been afraid to make a clear choice and that his inconsistency had contributed more than he had previously acknowledged. On the other end, there was silence. Then came a sentence he never expected. I always wondered why your version of the story never matched the way you looked whenever someone mentioned them. He almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because once again he was discovering that the truth he had hidden had apparently never been hidden as well as he imagined. People had noticed. They had seen the pauses. The changes in his expression. The strange distance that came over him whenever he claimed he was completely finished with the past. He had spent so much energy trying to control how everything appeared that he had forgotten something obvious. Real feeling leaves patterns. And yesterday, every pattern seemed to be pointing him toward the same conclusion. When that final call ended, there were no more conversations left to hide behind. No unfinished explanation he could use as a reason to delay. His phone was still where he had left it. Your message was still waiting on the screen. The room was quiet. This time, when he picked up the phone, his hands were steady. He read the message once. Then again. He removed one sentence that sounded like a promise he could not guarantee and replaced it with something more truthful. Then his thumb moved toward send. But just before he touched the screen, a notification appeared. Your name was there. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. You had not received his message. You had no way of knowing what he had spent the entire day changing. Yet somehow, at the exact moment he had finally become ready to speak honestly, you had sent him something first. It was not a confession. It was not a question about the relationship. It was only a few words connected to something the two of you had once shared, and the final sentence made him sit completely still, because without knowing anything about yesterday, you had written the one thing he had been preparing himself all night to tell you. Your message was simple enough that anyone else might have read it and moved on, but your soulmate knew immediately why it mattered, because the final sentence said, I think some things deserve honesty, even if it comes late. He stared at those words for several seconds, almost unable to believe the timing. You had no idea what he had changed yesterday. You did not know about the conversation with the third party, the future plan he had quietly stepped away from, the calls he had made to correct old misunderstandings, or the message he had been rewriting for nearly an hour. Yet somehow, you had reached the same word that had followed him through the entire day, honesty. And suddenly, the distance between you no longer felt like an empty space. It felt like a place where two people had been learning separate lessons that might finally allow them to speak differently. He read your message again, slower this time. There was nothing demanding in it. Nothing that told him what you wanted from him. That uncertainty would once have frightened him. Yesterday, strangely, it made him calmer. Because he was beginning to understand that the next chapter did not need to be guaranteed to be meaningful. It only needed to be real. Don't skip, because what he did next was completely different from what the old version of him would have done. Months earlier, he might have answered immediately with emotion, pouring out everything at once because he was afraid the opportunity would disappear. This time, he paused. Not to retreat. not to overthink. He simply wanted his first honest response to you to carry no hidden pressure. He opened the message he had already written, read it beside yours, and realized that most of what he needed to say was already there. So he added one line, "Your timing is strange, because honesty is exactly what I was finally preparing to give you tonight." Then he pressed send. No dramatic countdown. No certainty about what would happen next. Just one quiet action that he had postponed in different forms for far too long. The message delivered. He watched the screen, then caught himself doing something familiar, waiting for the little sign that you had seen it. A nervous feeling moved through him, but underneath it was something stronger. Relief. He had finally stopped hiding behind possibilities. Whatever happened next would belong to reality. And reality, even uncertain reality, suddenly felt kinder than the endless guessing he had lived inside. Your reply did not arrive instantly. A few minutes passed. Then several more. During that silence, his mind tried to return to its old habits. Maybe you were surprised. Maybe you regretted contacting him. Maybe too much time had passed. Maybe you had already decided that reopening this door would disturb the peace you had built. Every possible interpretation appeared. But this time he did not let imagination become truth. He put the phone down. That small act mattered. He was finally learning that respecting you also meant respecting the space between messages. He did not need to control your response. He only needed to remain honest in his own. Meanwhile, the third party was sitting with a very different kind of silence. The pain of yesterday had not disappeared, and nobody should pretend it had. They had lost an expectation they had believed was secure. Yet beneath that disappointment, another realization was beginning to form. Your soulmate's decision was not a sudden rejection created by one emotional evening. The cracks had existed much longer. There had been moments when he became distant after conversations about the future. Moments when his agreement sounded polite rather than excited. Moments when the third party had sensed that some part of him was somewhere else and chosen not to ask where. Yesterday did not create the truth. Yesterday simply removed the ability to avoid it. That was devastating, but also clarifying. And clarity, even when uncomfortable, gives every person involved the chance to stop investing in a story that no longer matches reality. Something important is waiting for you, because when your reply finally arrived, it did not give your soulmate the easy reassurance part of him secretly hoped for. You wrote that you appreciated what he had said, but you also needed to be honest. You had cared deeply. Perhaps part of you still did. But the distance had changed you. You could not simply return to the version of the connection that existed before. If there was ever going to be a conversation, it could not be built on old promises or nostalgia. It would have to begin from where both of you actually stood now. Your soulmate read those words and felt something unexpectedly warm move through him. He was not disappointed. He was impressed. Because this was the answer of someone who had learned their own value without turning that value into punishment. You were not closing the door. You were refusing to pretend that nothing had happened. And for the first time, he understood that this was exactly what he wanted too. Not to recover an old relationship exactly as it had been, but to discover whether something healthier could be built from the truth both of you now carried. He replied carefully. I understand. I don't want to go backward either. That sentence surprised him as soon as he wrote it. For so long, he had thought longing for you meant wanting to restore the past. But the past contained the very patterns that had separated you. Why would either of you want to repeat those? What he wanted was another chance to meet you without hiding. Another chance to hear what you had experienced while he was gone. Another chance to show consistency rather than simply describe feelings. And perhaps, if enough truth existed between you, something new might grow. Stay till the end, because this was when the meaning behind everything he changed yesterday became even clearer. The third party had believed that if your soulmate ever chose you, it would happen because emotion overwhelmed his judgment. Instead, the opposite was happening. He was slowing down. Becoming more thoughtful. Taking responsibility. Removing promises he could not keep. Correcting stories he had allowed others to misunderstand. Accepting that you were free to choose differently. That was what devastated the third party most deeply. This did not look like a passing rush of feeling. It looked like someone finally becoming deliberate. And deliberate change is difficult to dismiss. Your conversation continued slowly. Not constantly. There were pauses between messages, and those pauses no longer felt like games. They felt like care. You asked him what had happened yesterday that made him suddenly speak this way. He looked at the question for a long moment. Here was the temptation to tell you everything at once: the third party, the changed plan, the conversations, the realizations. But he knew that dropping the entire emotional weight of his day onto you would make the moment about proving something. So he answered with the center of the truth instead. He told you that he had finally recognized how often he had chosen what was easier to explain rather than what was actually honest. He said he had made some changes because continuing the way he had been living would have been unfair to several people, including you. Then he added something you did not expect: I'm not telling you this so you'll choose me. I'm telling you because you deserved clarity long ago. You read that sentence more than once. And somewhere inside you, perhaps a feeling shifted, not because everything was suddenly repaired, but because this was the first time his words did not seem to be asking you to carry the responsibility for his emotions. He was not saying, I changed everything, so now you owe me another chance. He was saying, I changed because I needed to become honest, and what you do with that truth is yours. That difference mattered. It created room. And room is something your connection had rarely possessed before. In the past, everything seemed intense. Every silence meant too much. Every conversation seemed connected to some enormous decision. Now, strangely, the smaller the moment became, the safer it felt. You asked how he was doing. Just that. He smiled at the screen because no one had asked him that all day without connecting the question to a decision. He answered that he felt relieved, sad, hopeful, and uncertain at the same time. You told him that sounded human. He laughed quietly. Those 3 words softened the entire evening. Not destiny. Not certainty. Not a promise. Human. Suddenly both of you were allowed to be people again rather than characters inside some impossible love story that had to resolve perfectly. And maybe that was exactly what made the possibility between you feel more real. The third party, meanwhile, made one final attempt to understand. They asked him whether he had spoken to you yet. He could have hidden it to avoid another difficult conversation, but yesterday had changed the rules he was trying to live by. So he said yes. He explained that the conversation was careful, that nothing had been decided, and that he had no intention of turning one ending into an immediate replacement. That answer hurt, but it also prevented another misunderstanding. He made it clear that his decision about the third party had been made before knowing how you would respond. He did not want them believing that their worth had been measured against yours in some competition. The issue was not who was better. The issue was that he had remained in a connection while part of him was unresolved elsewhere, and continuing would only deepen the unfairness. For the first time, the third party did not argue. They simply said, "I wish you had known this sooner." He answered quietly, "So do I." There was sadness there. Real sadness. Because growth often comes with the recognition that clarity arrived later than it should have. But instead of drowning in regret, your soulmate seemed determined to use that regret differently. Not as punishment. As instruction. He could not rewrite the months behind him. He could change the way he behaved in the next conversation, the next choice, the next moment when fear tempted him toward silence. And that became the true meaning behind the secret change he made for you yesterday. It was not one grand gesture. It was the beginning of a different pattern. Later, your messages became lighter. Neither of you planned it. One serious topic somehow led to a memory about something ridiculous that had happened when you first knew each other. You reminded him of a detail he had completely forgotten, and for the first time that night, he laughed openly. You did too. The warmth was familiar, but it did not feel like pretending the difficult parts had vanished. It felt like discovering that underneath all the confusion, there was still an ease between you that time had not entirely erased. That frightened him less than he expected. In fact, it made him realize why he had always returned mentally to you. It was not only the intensity. It was the combination of depth and simplicity. The way a conversation could move from something important to something ordinary without feeling empty. The way being understood did not always require explaining every detail. He had missed that more than he knew. But just as the evening seemed to soften, you asked one question that changed the emotional direction again. What exactly did you change yesterday? He stopped smiling. Not because he wanted to hide it. Because he knew the answer could sound bigger than he wanted it to. He did not want you feeling responsible for decisions you had never asked him to make. So he chose his words carefully. He told you there had been a future arrangement connected to the third party that he could no longer honestly continue. He had stepped away from it. He explained that this was not done as a promise to you. It was something he needed to do regardless of whether the two of you ever rebuilt anything. You were quiet for a while. Then you sent a message that made his chest tighten. "Thank you for telling me. But please don't change your life for an idea of me. If we ever talk about us, I want you to choose the real person I am now." He leaned back and read it again. There it was, the rare realization he had not known he needed. Perhaps part of his longing had indeed been attached to memories. Not false memories, but incomplete ones. You had changed. He had changed. Loving what existed before did not automatically mean understanding what existed now. And your words gave him a new responsibility. If he truly wanted to choose you, he could not simply choose the version of you stored in his past. He had to be curious about who you had become. He responded, "Then I want to know who you are now." No poetry. No dramatic declaration. Just curiosity. And somehow, that might have been the most intimate thing he had said all night. The conversation shifted again. You told him one thing that had changed in your life. Then another. Small things at first. A new routine. Something you had learned about yourself. A boundary you no longer apologized for. You told him you had discovered that peace mattered more to you than being understood by everyone. He admitted that he was only beginning to learn the same lesson. The symmetry was almost strange. Both of you had spent time apart becoming the kind of people who might finally understand why the original connection had struggled. Not because the feeling was absent, but because feeling alone had never been enough. Timing mattered. Courage mattered. Communication mattered. Self-respect mattered. And now, for perhaps the first time, those pieces were beginning to exist at the same time. Something still remained unresolved, though. Your soulmate knew it, and eventually you sensed it too. There was one subject neither of you had touched directly: why he had chosen the third party in the first place. Not the easy explanation. Not, "I was confused." The deeper reason. You asked him gently, without accusation, whether he understood it now. He stared at the message for nearly a minute. Yesterday had forced him to confront many things, but this question reached beneath all of them. Why had he walked toward a connection that felt safer while leaving behind one that felt more meaningful? He began typing, stopped, then started again. Finally, he told you something he had never said aloud. Being with you had made him feel more visible than he knew how to handle. You saw parts of him he had spent years keeping carefully managed. Around you, he could not easily perform the version of himself everyone else expected. And instead of recognizing that as intimacy, he had sometimes experienced it as vulnerability he needed to escape. The third party had entered his life at a moment when he was emotionally exhausted. That connection felt simpler because less of him was exposed. He mistook ease for compatibility and emotional intensity with you for danger. Only later did he realize that the discomfort was not coming from you. It was coming from how difficult it was to hide from himself around you. You did not respond immediately. When you finally did, your message contained no triumph. You simply wrote, "I always wondered if being seen scared you." Your soulmate froze. Because that sentence reached a place almost nobody else had ever touched. He had spent years thinking he was protecting himself from a complicated relationship. Now he saw that perhaps he had been protecting himself from the transformation that closeness required. And yesterday, when he secretly changed everything, the deepest thing he changed was not the future plan with the third party. It was his willingness to keep running from that transformation. Still, neither of you rushed to call this reconciliation. That restraint gave the night its quiet power. You agreed that perhaps a real conversation would be better than trying to unpack everything through messages. Nothing elaborate. Just a conversation. No expectations attached. Your soulmate suggested a time, then immediately added that you could choose another if you preferred. You smiled at that small detail because even there, something had changed. The old version of him might have treated the meeting like a turning point that had to happen exactly as imagined. The version speaking to you now seemed willing to let things unfold naturally. You agreed to talk. And when the plan was settled, neither of you added some dramatic final declaration. You simply wished each other a good night. Yet after putting the phone down, your soulmate sat in the quiet with a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. He was not fantasizing about an ending. He was looking forward to a beginning. There is a difference. An ending wants certainty. A beginning only asks for presence. And perhaps that was why he finally slept peacefully after a day that had changed so much. But what he did not know was that shortly before you went to sleep, you opened an old conversation too. You found something he had sent you long ago, a message written during one of the moments when he had almost been brave enough to tell you everything. At the time, you had read it one way. Tonight, after everything he had finally admitted, you noticed a sentence hidden in plain sight that suddenly carried a completely different meaning. And when the two of you speak next, that forgotten sentence may become the one piece of the past neither of you can explain away anymore.